This is then across the rows. No, it's producing all these random numbers, and it's got n in this direction and the number of dimensions in this direction. Okay. This command takes the square of every element and then adds them across the rows. So that's the sum of all the dimensions squared. And then I find all the ones that are less than or equal to the square of r, and the ones that are where it's greater than or equal to the square of r. This is the answer that I'm supposed to get when it's 2D. And then I've just sort of added here, there's better ways to plot it depending on whether you're in 2 or 3D. So let's see if it works for 3 dimensions. We also know what the volume of the sphere is, right? So there's the same thing happening in 3D. And in this case, I'm supposed to be getting 4/3 pi, right? And the relative error here is a little bit larger because there's a larger volume that I'm having to sample. But it seems to be working pretty well. All right. So now let's do 4 dimensions. R is 1. Now I'm plotting just 2 of the coordinates, and there's 4, right? So the first thing that you realize when you look at this, right, is that it's not actually staying within the circle in these 2 dimensions. Okay, and if you think about it for a while, you can sort of see why. If you crank it up, that'll become more and more clear. So 100 times more. We can wait 100 times longer. Right? See? Okay. Those are all points that are they're outside the 4-dimensional sphere. This is even going the wrong way, right? I'm supposed to be plotting the red afterwards, I think, to be making my point. So let me go back down. 5. Yeah, so the point I'm trying to make is that this red extends outside of the circle here, okay? And you can understand that that has to be true since this is a projection from higher dimensional space. All right, now we have our answer. The number that we're getting is, well, I've got the correct answer here because I know the formula. But this is the number that we've been calculating. So let's say we let this run for quite a long time, like a second or 2. Let's make this 7. Now the problem is going to be graphing the thing. So now we can see that the error is really small, so we would be able to be relatively confident in this number, right? So now you would try to figure out what that number was, right? There's probably an r to the 4th power, right? Because it's a 4-dimensional object. But there's some prefactor here, and we don't know what it is. Can anyone guess what's 4.9348? This is another really important skill. When you see a little decimal number, you want to be able to pick out like square root of 2, inverse of square root of 2, square root of 3 over 2. You should have you should know all those, right? So what's turns out that that is 1/2 of pi squared. So, I mean, I think by doing this, I got a little bit of a better sense of what was really meant by that that sense of a volume of a 4-dimensional object. If you're interested, there's the general. You can do this through calculus, and it's the bounding area is always the derivative of the volume with respect to r. All right, now that's it for my slides, but I have more examples of code that I want to show you. Do that. So, okay, so I guess the first part of my talk is about, when you're trying to understand something and you see something symbolically in a book, all right? You can often understand a little bit more deeply what it actually means if you just take the time to quickly code something up in MATLAB, and if you become familiar with these sort of Monte Carlo ways of thinking about things, right? Just drawing random numbers and checking if certain conditions are satisfied or plotting, right? You can end up, there's a lot of these sorts of results that you'll read about, right? You can very quickly confirm them and understand a little bit about what's going on. It doesn't substitute for the more theoretical mathematical knowledge, right? But if you can make a picture, it's going to help a lot in terms of understanding. Now, what do you do? This is about big data, okay? So what are we going to do when we get a big data set, all right? So I'm trying to teach you a lesson in a sense, okay? I just gave you 4 examples or something of things that if you read really quickly, you might think you understand them, and you realize you don't really understand them, but if you code them up, you start to understand what's going on because you see a picture, right? So what are we going to do when somebody gives us a very large multi-dimensional data set? That's what we're doing here, right?
At least one thing we try to do.
So what would you do? I think I'm going to do this. This should be something that that you try here. Data wrangling, I don't know what to call it, right? You get a bunch of data and you just have to figure out something about it. You haven't been in my courses, but the way I work is if I ask a question, I actually am waiting until someone answers it. A lot of people just go on, it's like rhetorical, but when I'm actually asking you. So
Do you want a specific answer, or
yeah,
do you want us to just say MATLAB?
No. MATLAB. That was wrong one time. Right?
Yeah,
Okay. So we're going to maybe use
It's not
MATLAB.
freebie anymore.
All right. So we're going to take the data, we're going to actually load it into some piece of software, right? But then what do we do? We plot it, okay? And this is what I'm trying to get across, all right? Don't be doing Fourier transforms of the data, all right? Okay? Don't numerically take the derivative of the data, right? The first thing you do is you think of all the ways that it makes sense to plot it, right? And just see if you notice anything, okay? See if you notice anything about the data. So, so that's one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to put a block of data. It's going to be unbearably large, okay, in the sense that you'll never be able to sort through it by hand and figure out what it is. And you're asked to, using with your favorite software package, MATLAB, okay, you're going to load it in, and you're going to tell me what the algorithm was that produced the data. When you figure it out, it'll be absolutely obvious. All right? And I may even set this up so that there's a series of hints. Okay? I don't want you to bang your head all week long. All right? But it's really it's a nice little exercise to think about. You just given something and you don't really know much about its structure, right? And so you just have to think about the different ways that you might look at it. Okay? Certain things might give you clues, right? What could we do? If we plot it, let's say it's 4 columns, right? And they're not even in any order, so you just got 4 columns. And what would you think of doing? Any ideas?
We get the mean and variance of height of the columns.
Yeah, okay. You could start looking at some of the statistics. So maybe we'll assume that the columns are meaningful, right? And we can look at statistics across any column. You might presume that the longer columns are the observations, whereas the shorter dimension are the variables, right? You might make that assumption and then do this. Histograms are good, right? Because if you actually look at a histogram of one of them, one of the dimensions, you actually get an overall view of what's going on. You don't see the correlations. But if you looked at one dimension and you saw it was Gaussian or it was normal or it was uniform or exponential, it might give you a real clue about how to interpret a particular column. Right? If you looked at something, if you assume that I'm giving you a relatively complex signal, right, then a column that you look at where you look at the distribution and it doesn't look like anything recognizable, you might assume that's actually the dependent variable, right? Okay. With that said, after when you have a data set, the first thing I'm trying to say, the take-home message number one is use computers to help you visualize even simple problems so that you can understand them better. Use computers as the first step in your data analysis in just terms of figuring out how to graph things, all right? That's the second take-home message. The third one is, I'm not going to have time to convince you of this yet, maybe if I come back and give another lecture, right? The third thing is, you have absolutely no hope of understanding big data unless you have some understanding of how the data was generated. You have to have a working model, right, of how you're arriving at the data. I mean, the simplest thing might be, is that first column actually proportional to the time, right? That's a really important piece of information if it's true. Okay, so you are going to need to know something about how your data is being generated. And, almost everything that you would ask about your data, when you calculate the answer, like if you produced one of these mean and variance histograms, right? How are you going to know whether what you see is important, right? Whether it's something that you should pay attention to, because these numbers are going to come up. The mean is 3.2 and the variance is 6. Or let's say the mean was 3.2 and the variance was 3.15. Okay, do we know anything about what that might mean? So one of the reasons why you want to play with small data sets and get really familiar with something like MATLAB is you can start producing your own simulated data and looking at its statistics, right? So if you randomly picked positions in this two-dimensional square, like we've done, and then we randomly pick conditions and we only take the ones that are in the circle. But then what I do is for every two dots, right, I look at the distance between them. It's not very long before I have a lot of observations, right? And if you were, say, an ecologist working on some problem where you were interested in the spatial distribution of seeds or something, okay? You probably want to know. You probably want to have a little piece of code where you could code up and simulate what these distributions might look like. So the distribution where this is the interparticle distance, and this is just the count. Right? What does that look like? How does it depend on the boundary? How big does it need to be before it doesn't depend on the boundary? Right? What causes the boundary to not matter anymore? Because if the boundary is going to be the only thing that you see in here, then you want to know what the shape of the sample actually came from when you're working with someone, right? So I can give you a bunch of different examples, I suppose, but one of the lessons that you should learn right away is that you have to understand, you have to have a hypothesis about how the data is being generated, right? Because then you can code that up, produce simulated data, and ask questions about that data, and then compare it to what you get in the experimental data, and you can get some sense of what you're seeing is important or not, or different from how you imagined it being produced. I think I'll stop there. Any questions? No? All right, if you're interested in my research, just look at my webpage, come on down and talk sometime. And did you have a question, Jumping?
No, I
Okay.
just asked what this program do.
This one, I guess what I was gonna say is, after you've done everything that I asked about, then you can start doing like some of the things that engineers would tell you to do, look at power spectra and stuff like that, okay? So looking at, there's sort of a direction that you can go off the way an engineer thinks about signal analysis, and there's the direction that you go off where statisticians think about multivariate statistical analysis, clustering, and so there's sort of these two different directions that you can go, and you should kind of get familiar with the way that you can do both of those quickly in some piece of software so that you can actually do real problems.
Thank you.